Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Easter Island and the Moai. Easter Island is one of the most isolated places in the world. It's in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, with its closest neighbor being Pitcairn Island, over 1,000 miles away. It's like the distance from London to Bucharest, with nothing separating the two except the endless ocean. 64 square miles of volcanic rock formed the island, with Mount Terevaka towering over the scenery 1,800 feet tall. The first settlers were Polynesians. DNA testing on ancient skeletons found on Easter Island show that the Rapa Nui arrived from elsewhere in the Pacific. They brought with them chickens, rats, and bananas. Nobody knows when exactly they showed up. It was likely between 300 and 1200 AD, but the exact date is unknown. Now let's talk about the statues. The big draw to Easter Island is its hundreds of nearly identical giant stone figures known as moai. The earliest of them all were built around the year 1250, with construction continuing for 250 years. During those 2.5 centuries, the Rapa Nui built about 1,500 of these things. 900 of the statues have been found at the same sites where the stone was quarried. Another 600 are scattered randomly throughout the island. Many of them aren't even complete. Even more strange is the fact that most of them are partially buried. People used to call them the Easter Island heads until scientists realized their bodies are buried many feet beneath the earth. Researchers know what they were made of. Locals carved the statues out of compressed volcanic ash, also known as tuff. The tallest moai ever found was 30 feet in height and 82 tons. But there is an unfinished statue that would have been twice as big if it had been completed. The unfinished piece of stonework would have towered above the rest of the statues at nearly 60 feet in height and an astounding 270 tons. As for what the statues represent, it's an unsolved mystery. Scientists only recently learned the statues used to wear weird red hats, but most of them have been destroyed. The Ballbek Temple Stones. The Ballbek temple complex was built by astronaut gods. At least that was what researcher Zecharia Sitchin wrote in his book about the Anunnaki and their role in the creation of civilization. Mainstream scientists say the temple complex was built by ordinary people who occupied the region starting around 8000 BC. Baalbek is currently in ruins in Lebanon, not far from Beirut. Believe it or not, it was home to a population of nearly 100,000 Shia Muslims as of 1998. These people live just outside the remnants of the temple complex, which includes two of the greatest constructions ever completed by the Romans, the Temple of Bacchus and the Temple of Jupiter. Although the Romans left their mark 2,000 years ago, human occupation dates back at least 8,000 or 9,000 years. The first colony may have been a group of Egyptian or Assyrian priests, but it's not really clear. During the biblical Canaanite period of the Bronze Age, local temples arose within the complex in worship of Baal, his consort Astarte, and their son Adon. Baal was one of the most sinister gods mentioned in the Bible, a god who supposedly demanded child sacrifices from his followers. Archaeological evidence shows the amazing stonework of the earliest temples was the product of the first settlers from Egypt or Assyria. However, the stonework is so impressive that some suspect scientists are missing something. Abandoned constructs have been found near the site, huge stone blocks that were cut and moved but now lie lifeless in the dirt. Many of these stones have never been accounted for, but Zecharia Sitchin thinks they were from an earlier complex. He and others, like Graham Hancock, suggest the original complex was the work of the Anunnaki, the great alien gods of Mesopotamia. And now for number 8, but first, it's shoutout time! I want to give a big thank you to Amy DeLong and Ian Donovan for supporting this channel. Thank you so much! Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. The carvings of Asuka Village. These days, Asuka Village in Japan is a small and fairly quiet place. But in ancient times, it was the first capital of the island nation. Japan's oldest Buddhist temple is located here, called Asuka Dera. There are multiple Kofun tomb mounds, likely built for the original members of the first Japanese royal family. There are also strange examples of stonework found throughout the area. The Saru-ishi monkey stones are particularly fascinating. Experts don't know what their original purpose was, only that they were uncovered in modern times by farmers. The farmers were annoyed by having stones in their fields, so they moved them. Now the stones aren't even in their original positions, so they've been exceptionally hard to study. They're called monkey stones because they kind of look like carved primates. An even more mysterious example of stonework is something called the Oni-Sechin Demon Toilet. It's even more mysterious than the monkey stones because it doesn't look like anything particular, other than maybe a huge toilet. It must have been part of something important, but all other traces of it are gone. All that remains is this perfectly carved boulder at the edge of the forest. It's been around so long that locals have a legend to explain its existence. For years, they've told stories of how demons preyed on wayward travelers in the area. When demons kidnapped a weary human, they typically cut them up and ate them. Then the demons used the giant carved stone as a toilet. The stone walls of Sakaiman. At the northern edge of the ancient city of Cusco in Peru, there still stands the walled complex of Sakaiman. It's one of the most famous sites in South America because of its stonework. The walls here were built using perfectly cut stones that fit together like puzzle pieces. They didn't use mortar to seal the stones. Instead, they were cut with such precision that they fit together without needing any kind of sealing paste. They've been standing for over 500 years, and you still can't fit a piece of paper between the cracks in the stone. Out of every other ancient complex in the Americas, Sakaiman is arguably the most impressive. So, how did they do it? Experts aren't entirely sure. There have been a lot of theories put forward. John Macaulay, who spent his life as an architect and construction manager, has been looking at these walls for over 40 years. John believes the stones, which weigh upwards of 200 tons, were transported to the site using timber sleds. However, model testing has shown that it would have taken about 1,000 men to move stones via timber sleds. Imagine 1,000 guys pulling on ropes to get giant stone blocks to an altitude of 3,700 meters. Sure, it's possible, but highly unlikely. The hard truth is that scientists have no logical way of explaining how the Inca built this amazing complex outside their capital of Cusco. Do you have any theories? Let me know in the comments. The Angkor Stones. The temple complex of Angkor in Cambodia is the largest of its kind in the world by a significant margin. In the 12th century, the Khmer Empire built this city as their shining capital. Deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia, Angkor thrived for centuries. It's still in an amazing state of preservation, with thousands of tourists a day traveling its ancient streets. Archaeologists have counted around 10 million bricks here, some of them 3,300 pounds. The bricks were likely taken from quarries at the base of a mountain not far away, then transported by boat and used in the construction. Archaeologists looked at satellite images of the area to identify 50 quarries along the bottom of Mount Kulin. How did they do it? The current theory is that the Khmer took stone from these quarries and ferried it to the city using 22 miles of artificial canals and paved roads. The greatest thing built at Angkor is the main temple, called Angkor Wat. It was commissioned by King Suryavarman II to honor Vishnu, the great Hindu god. The city was most certainly not created by aliens, but it was still a crazy feat of engineering. For a civilization who lived deep in the jungle and had very little in the way of technology, their stonework was unsurpassed. The Cham Towers. In Nha Trang City, Vietnam, the Ponagar Cham Towers stand as a sturdy reminder of the ancient Cham people who dominated this part of Southeast Asia. The architectural work of the towers is fantastic. They stand at the edge of the Khai River on a tall hill, built between the 7th and 13th centuries. This was a time when the Champa Kingdom ruled Vietnam. The main structure, Ponagar Tower, was built to worship Queen Po Ina Nagar. The Cham believed her to be the goddess of creation, the creator of life who was born from clouds and sea foam. Much of the Great Tower is in ruins, with only the stairs remaining from its original gateway. Several of the columns still stand, but the walls have been destroyed. The main temple is still in excellent shape, with the original baked bricks holding the structure together. The whole temple is covered in beautiful statues and reliefs of mythical creatures like fairies. The Cham Towers are a testament to the building prowess of the first great civilization of Vietnam. It's also a great example of how overlooked many ancient sites in Asia are, with stonework to rival that of the Romans. The mysterious ditch. In the town of Waimea on Kauai, there's a small ditch on the side of an unassuming road. It's a narrow waterway that once channeled water from the Waimea River to the lower valley. It might look like a modern creation, but it is, in fact, ancient. So ancient that archaeologists don't know who built it. The ditch consists of 120 perfectly cut blocks of basalt stone. It's unique in that these stones do not appear anywhere else in ancient Hawaiian constructions. Only a small piece of the original ditch is still visible. However, there is an account from Captain George Vancouver, who explored Hawaii in 1793. George described a megalithic aqueduct standing 24 feet tall, but by 1924, modern construction had erased almost every trace of the aqueduct. Now, only the tiny stretch of ditch remains as a reminder of the stonework. Researchers think the stonework predates the Tahitian settlers of Hawaii in the 14th century. It may also predate the Marquesan settlers of the 13th century. Some suggest the ancient aqueduct was built by the mysterious Menehune, the legendary dwarf people who supposedly lived in Hawaii long before it was settled. It could be the only proof that the Menehune really existed. The Mongolian steels. Across the wind-swept valleys and grassy fields of Mongolia, there are around 1,000 steels known as deer stones. The stones are simple monuments, carved pieces of rock decorated in complex designs. Researchers believe all of them were built during a short span of time between 1200 and 800 BC. They were the creations of a mysterious nomadic civilization known as the Deer Stone culture. Basically, nothing is known about this early Mongolian civilization. They didn't build cities, choosing instead to roam freely across the great expanses of land. They likely kept reindeer and migrated with the seasons. Nobody knows why they took the time to carve hundreds of interesting stone monoliths. One of the coolest sites is the Tsatsin Ereg necropolis. Scientists have identified 113 deer stones here. They believed it was an ancient burial ground and a place of cultic activity. Underneath each stone monument was discovered a severed horse head, suggesting it was all part of an unknown funerary ritual. Cleopatras Needle. If you've ever visited Central Park in New York City, you may have walked right past an ancient Egyptian monument without knowing. There is a fantastic example of Egyptian stonework from the 15th century BC, smack dab in the middle of the park. It's called Cleopatra's Needle, taken from the ruins of the Alexandrian city of Caesarium in the 19th century. It was transported from Egypt to the US, then installed just outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1881. It was given as a gift to the Consul General of Cairo, Judge Albert E. Farman. The obelisk is a sight to behold, standing an incredible 69 feet tall. It weighs around 200 tons and is covered in Egyptian hieroglyphics. The man behind its creation was Pharaoh Thutmose III in 1475 BC. The granite used to build it was taken from quarries near Aswan, then transported up the Nile River. The inscriptions on the obelisk weren't carved until about 200 years later, when Ramses II came to power. He hijacked the old monument to commemorate his military victories. Then, 1,200 years after that, the Romans hijacked the monument and moved it to Alexandria, setting it outside a temple built by Cleopatra. It was finally hijacked again a fourth time, all the way across the world to New York. How did the Egyptians bore through granite? For years, scientists have been trying to figure out how Egyptians worked with solid granite, molding it to their will. Their biggest challenge has been trying to figure out how the Egyptians drilled through granite, creating perfect holes that look like they were machined. The mainstream view of archaeologists is that they did it using copper, bronze, and a little ingenuity. Others think they were using significantly more advanced technology, sophisticated equipment that you could find at any modern hardware store. There could be a reason the advanced technology theory has been around for so long. In the 19th century, the archaeologists who studied Egypt were mostly men of the aristocracy. These were upper-class men with enough money to fund expeditions. They weren't exactly people who were practiced in heavy labor. When they encountered the massive stone blocks and the perfect holes, they couldn't understand how it was done. They assumed the Egyptians were simple folk with hammers and chisels, so they came up with theories about cranes and highly advanced implements. These days, archaeologists are convinced the Egyptians were much more clever than they were given credit for. One of the main theories is that to bore through granite, Egyptians used a wooden wedge and water. They drove the wedge into a crack in the rock, then soaked the wedge with water. The water caused the wedge to expand, widening the crack. This was done repeatedly until the Egyptians eventually bored through incredibly tough stone. Thanks for watching! Be sure to stay tuned for extra content you might have missed. Nabta Playa. One of the world's oldest stone circles, that of Nabta Playa, is located deep in the Nubian desert, roughly 500 miles south of Cairo, in one of the most dry, hot, and inhospitable environments on the planet. The site predates pre-dynastic Egypt and is perhaps the origin of ancient Egyptian astronomy, which means it may also be the oldest known example of the Egyptian civilization itself. Anthropology professor Fred Windorf discovered the barely noticeable quartzite sandstone rock formation in 1974, when he nearly walked past it without spotting its potential significance. Thankfully, he took a second glance and uncovered what might be signs of an ancient society that engaged in rituals beyond those characteristic of hunter-gatherer civilizations. The rocks at Nabta Playa are more or less perfectly aligned with the 4 cardinal directions, and this arrangement suggests that the region hosted a civilization scholars do not yet know much about, which existed around 7,500 years ago. This purported society engaged in cultural practices, as evidenced by its surviving megaliths, including the stone circle, which may have been used to track the summer and fall equinoxes. Archaeoastronomy is a somewhat new scientific discipline, and evidence of it suggests that ancient people perhaps had a more well-rounded knowledge of the stars, celestial bodies, and movement of the Earth than we typically give them credit for. Archimedes' Death Ray. Ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes is credited with inventing at least 2 weapons: the Archimedes' claw, which cleverly defended the city of Syracuse from naval attacks and devastated the Roman fleet, and the lesser-known Death Ray, which is described as a series of mirrors or polished bronze that were arranged to reflect the sun's rays at enemy ships. This legendary death ray remains elusive in historical archives. If this death ray was used, why hadn't more historians mentioned it like they did with the claw? And if a huge mirror had worked in burning enemy ships, why was it never used in other battles? Mythbusters had tried to recreate this experiment but failed. Pretty much all attempts at creating a modern version of the death ray failed until 2,200 years after its time. In 2005, some MIT students managed to combust a ship in San Francisco Harbor using 127 small square mirrors arranged in a concave arc or parabola. After 10 minutes of uninterrupted concentrated sunlight, the model ship caught fire and quickly burned. But the students didn't necessarily solve the puzzle of the death ray. For one, it's unlikely that an enemy ship would have sat still while the weapon did its work. Secondly, the experiment was conducted from a solid rooftop, not factoring in how even calm motion from a boat would impact the ancient laser's effectiveness. In 1973, a Greek engineer performed his own experiment and had 70 people each hold a 5-foot by 3-foot mirror. The concentrated beam made a rowboat 160 feet away burst into flames. So it is possible that the death ray actually worked. While some suggest that the death ray is a mere myth, given the lack of mentionings it received from authors around the time it was supposedly used, others remain hard at work, trying to recreate the genius left by Archimedes. And now for number 9, but first want to say a big thank you to Kaylee Pernal and Necromancer111 for supporting this channel. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more videos like these. Ancient Egyptian Stoneworking. The ancient Egyptians left behind clear evidence of drilling and shaping hard stones like granite, basalt, quartzite, and diorite. Due to their hardness, these materials are difficult to work with, even with modern tools, posing the obvious question of how the Egyptians fashioned so many beautiful objects out of these tough materials, and what tools did they use to do it? For example, the famous unfinished obelisk, which still sits in the granite bedrock it was being cut from before the project was abandoned, has a Mohs hardness between 6 and 7. Mohs hardness is a rough measure of the resistance of a smooth surface to scratching or abrasion from 1 to 10, with 1 being talc and 10 being a diamond. Many scholars believe that dolerite tools were used for cutting the obelisk, yet as writer Brian Forrester points out, dolerite is nearly the same hardness as granite, suggesting that it may not have been useful for this task. Plus, many scholars attribute other ancient Egyptian works to being fashioned from bronze tools, which has a Mohs hardness of just 3.5. Skeptics believe that much harder tools were required to shape certain stone artifacts that are dated to dynastic Egypt, and that perhaps these items are from another time, maybe pre-dynastic Egypt, and were created using some other tool that for now remains unknown. Sacsayhuaman, an ancient Incan complex in Cusco, Peru, contains walls that are so well fitted even modern technology cannot explain their accuracy. This site is famous for its large stone walls with boulders of all shapes and sizes so tightly packed that not even a piece of paper can get through. No mortar was used in their construction, and the stones used weigh up to 200 tons. They are among the largest used in pre-Hispanic America and demonstrate the Incas' extraordinary engineering skills. But it also poses many questions, including how and why stones of all sizes, possessing little to no consistency with their dimensions, fit so perfectly together. Only around 40% of the original structure survives, and it is believed that roughly 20,000 laborers were required to erect the entirety of what once stood at the site. Researchers are admittedly unsure how Sacsayhuaman's builders moved such large stones, let alone cut them to precision with virtually no room for error. John McCauley, retired architect and construction manager, says, "We have to remind ourselves that the steady rise in mankind's mastery of technology has taken place over thousands of years of trial and error. Mastery of a successful technique in moving heavy stones or in carving them has only occurred because of the knowledge passed on through the failure and success of countless ancient engineers. It's most likely that the stones were shaped using very heavy pounders and countless hours of labor." The Yakal. Modern refrigeration technology is relatively recent, with artificial refrigeration beginning as early as 1834 and becoming a common household item much later on, after refrigerators for home use were first developed in 1913. But the ancients figured out their own ways of keeping perishables cold as early as 1000 BC, with various civilizations who were located in hotter climates relying on what's called a Yakal. The Persians are credited with its development and widespread use starting around 400 BC. It was a thick, dome-shaped structure that cooled the air through water evaporation. They were made of a special insulating mortar called sarouge, which contained sand, clay, egg whites, goat hair, lime, and ash. Powered by both insulation in the form of walls up to 6.5 feet thick, along with cooling waters which were channeled into the vessel, Yakals were sophisticated enough to keep ice from underground canals kept cold year-round, even in scorching desert climates. These advanced buildings also contained trenches, where melted ice refroze during the cold desert nights. Much like people use ice for today, the ice created within Yakals cooled certain foods on hot days, including traditionally frozen desserts. These delicacies were at first created for royalty, but then were available to commoners too, many who privately owned these cooling devices to get some much-needed summertime refreshment. Otherwise, you could go and get some tasty cold drinks and frozen dessert from the bazaar. Did you know that you could get a cold dessert 1,000 years ago? Me neither, my friend. Flexible glass. Legend holds that the Romans developed a type of flexible, shatterproof glass known as vitrum flexile. The Phoenicians are credited with developing the first man-made glass, and it eventually became commonly manufactured throughout the Roman Empire, where artisans sought to perfect the craft. The rumored invention of flexible glass supposedly occurred during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, according to Pliny the Elder's Natural History, as well as the Satyricon, a text thought to be written by a man named Petronius. Pliny's written account of flexible glass discusses how Tiberius Caesar banned the Roman glassmaker's invention to keep the value of precious metals like gold, silver, and copper from plummeting. Furthermore, Pliny admitted that the truthfulness of the story was questionable, but that the story nonetheless spread widely and for a long time. In his writings, Petronius describes how the flexible glassmaker demonstrated his work to Tiberius by throwing a cup on the ground, which, to the emperor's shock, did not break. It was dented from the impact, however, so the inventor used a small hammer to reshape it to its original form. Upon learning that the glassmaker possessed the only knowledge of how to make flexible glass, Tiberius executed him, ensuring that the unfortunate inventor took the secret recipe to his grave, and he did this for the same reasons Pliny mentioned, to preserve the value of precious metals. Like Pliny, modern researchers doubt that flexible glass ever actually existed, but they have also tried determining that if it did exist, what would it be made out of? The strongest theory is that the glassmaker had gotten his hands on some boric oxide. This would have greatly strengthened his product, but this does not explain the flexible aspect of the fabled material. Perhaps it was some form of early plastic discovery? Who knows? If flexible glass was real, there is still a very real chance that we'll never know what it was made from, given the limited known records of it. Nepentha. Antidepressants first came along in the era of modern medicine during the 1950s, but one alleged drug called Nepentha may have existed long before then, during ancient Greece. Frequently mentioned in Greek literature, including Homer's Odyssey, Nepentha was reportedly used to chase away sorrow and was considered a drug of forgetfulness. Depictions of the medicine claim that it originated in Egypt. The pre-modern pharmaceutical is commonly considered fictional, but many have also argued that Nepentha probably existed. Pliny the Elder believed that Nepentha was an herb known as borage or star flower. Others, including French writer Matthias Enard and Oxford University researcher Philip Robson, suggested that the drug in question was opium or opium-based, perhaps laudanum. Additional suggestions include wormwood extract and scopolamine, an anti-nausea drug. If Nepentha existed, its ingredients are not necessarily lost, but perhaps hiding in plain sight. Library of Alexandria. Once housing somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 papyrus scrolls, the Great Library of Alexandria was one of the ancient world's largest and most important libraries. Unfortunately, many, if not most of its contents are long gone. The library was founded around 300 BC. Its centuries-long decline began in 145 BC when intellectuals were purged from Alexandria, causing the head librarian to flee to Cyprus. Then, in 48 BC, Julius Caesar accidentally set the building on fire, burning part of its collection. It's unknown how much of the material was destroyed, but the library itself seems to have either survived or been rebuilt after the fire. A lack of funding and support caused the library to dwindle during the Roman period, and sometime during the 260s AD, its membership seems to have ended. Whatever remained of the library, if anything, would have probably been destroyed between 270 and 275 AD, when Alexandria underwent a rebellion and subsequent counterattack. For obvious reasons, the lost works are unknown, but they are believed to include texts from prominent scholars of the time, including Zenodotus and Astrophanes of Byzantium, who spent considerable time studying in Alexandria. Who knows what wealth of knowledge was lost during that time. Roman concrete. Developed sometime during the 18th century, modern concrete is a relatively simple mixture containing cement, water, sand, and rocks. It's the world's most widely used building material, and it appears that the ancients favored their versions of it too. The Persians, Egyptians, Assyrians, and Romans all used concrete, and it was especially popular in the Roman Empire. The Romans are credited with perfecting ancient concrete, as evidenced by some of the structures they made with it, which are still standing over 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire fell. This is not only impressive, it's shocking, especially since, according to science author Zara Ahmad, even the most durable modern concrete can break down in as little as half a century. Perplexed scientists discovered that an incredibly rare mineral called aluminum tobermerite had formed in the concrete where volcanic ash had dissolved, strengthening Roman concrete over time. It appears that the Romans may have poured seawater into the mixture, causing it to react with volcanic ash, producing aluminum tobermerite and another strengthening mineral, philipsite. But this process takes centuries, and scientists have yet to develop a similar but quicker forming solution. A universal antidote. Mithridates of Pontus, a relentless ruler who orchestrated mass killings and was a bitter foe of the Romans during his reign from 120 to 63 BC, supposedly developed Mithridate, a universal antidote to all known toxins at the time. His paranoia about potential assassination attempts led the king to study and experiment until he finally came up with the right solution to protect himself, according to records. To prove the effectiveness of his drug, Mithridates reportedly consumed and survived fatal doses of poison in front of audiences. Pliny the Elder and numerous other ancient authors wrote about the elixir, which Mithridates ingested regularly. According to Pliny, Mithridate contained around 50 ingredients that were ground into a honey mixture and solidified into tablets, but the recipe was lost, and researchers can only speculate about what was in this alleged miracle drug. Some ancient historians believe that Mithridate was made up of opium, arsenic, and various venoms, thereby essentially immunizing Mithridates to certain toxins. Another theory suggests that Mithridates' universal antidote was simply a tall tale that the king told to make his enemies fear him even more, and that the substances he consumed to prove that the drug worked were harmless, but looked like known poisons. If Mithridate did exist, nobody knows for sure what was in it. Iron Ashoka Pillar of Delhi. In New Delhi, India, sits a seemingly unimportant iron pillar that has withstood the test of time in a way that modern iron can't even remotely compete with, especially when exposed to the elements. At roughly 1,600 years old, and with an iron purity of 98%, the Iron Ashoka Pillar of Delhi is considered an out-of-place artifact, or upart, which is an object that does not fit with the time or place it comes from. It's arguable whether the iron pillar reflects a lost technology, but it's definitely a reflection of the superior skill set that ancient Indian ironsmiths possessed, putting their work seemingly far ahead of their time. Why and how the pillar avoided corrosion for nearly 2 millennia is another story. This was apparently not done deliberately, but occurred as a byproduct of the iron-making method used, a very specific combination of factors, including a lack of lime in the furnaces used for making the iron, the weather's wetting and drying cycles, and the presence of raw slag and unreduced iron in the pillar created a 1/20th millimeter thick layer of something called misawite. This substance, an iron, oxygen, and hydrogen that does not rust, formed a protective layer on the pillar, which has kept it in pristine condition far beyond its expectancy. It took modern-day researchers a long time to figure out, and perhaps it was the maker's intent to make sure that this pillar has withstood the test of time, which is what all ancient builders seem to take on as their challenge. Thanks for watching! Which one was your favorite? What other surprising aspects of the ancient world would you like to learn about? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time! Bye!